December fills our streets with lights, trees, and celebration. But have we ever stopped to wonder if, just a few doors away, there are families who only dream of Christmas? Mothers who don't ask for help, even when their hearts are breaking. Children with big Christmas wishes and empty hands. Could placing a gentle hand on a child's head be enough to warm both our conscience and our faith? Could kindness be the gift that matters most? This video tells a quiet, painful story, one that might stay with you longer than you expect. December came to the little house on Maple Street the way it always did, quiet and cold. But inside that small home lived a 35-year-old widow and her 2 children, counting every penny and hoping Christmas would still find them. The heat stayed low, the pantry nearly empty, and somewhere beneath the kitchen sink a glass jar waited to be filled. Evelyn woke before dawn, the way she had every morning since Robert died. The bedroom felt larger now, emptier. She pulled her worn robe tight around her shoulders and moved through the dim hallway, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor. In the kitchen, she opened the pantry and looked at what remained: half a loaf of bread, some oatmeal in a tin, a few potatoes in a paper sack. She closed the door gently and put water on the stove for coffee, using yesterday's grounds a second time. The children were still asleep in the room they shared at the end of the hall. Billy had turned 8 in October. Susie was 6 now, small for her age. They slept under 2 blankets and their father's old winter coat, pressed together for warmth, the way puppies do. Evelyn stood in their doorway for a moment, watching their faces in the gray light. Billy's jaw had started to look like Robert's. Susie's hair fell across her pillow the same way Evelyn's had when she was young. 2 years had passed since the accident at the factory. 2 years since the foreman came to the door with his hat in his hands and words that changed everything. The insurance money had lasted 8 months, the savings after that another 6. Now there was nothing left but what Evelyn could earn with her sewing and the careful way she stretched every dollar until it tore. She returned to the kitchen and sat at the small table with her weak coffee. The newspaper lay folded where she'd left it the night before, still unread. She couldn't afford the subscription anymore, but Mrs. Patterson next door saved her copies. Evelyn smoothed the pages and looked at the advertisements. Toys for Christmas, dresses, coats, things that belonged to a different world. The telephone rang just after 7. Evelyn answered it quietly, hoping not to wake the children. It was her sister, Margaret, calling from across town. Margaret's voice came through bright and hurried, full of complaints about the holiday preparations. The tree was too expensive this year. The children wanted too many things. Her husband worked late every evening. Evelyn listened and made small sounds of sympathy at the right moments. When Margaret finally paused, Evelyn asked if they might come for Christmas dinner. Margaret hesitated. She said something about the house being too small for extra guests this year, about how busy everything had become. She said maybe next year. She said she had to go. The children were fighting over something. The line went dead before Evelyn could say goodbye. Evelyn stood holding the receiver for a moment longer, then placed it back in its cradle. She'd expected nothing different, but expectation didn't soften the sting. The children woke an hour later. Billy came out first, rubbing his eyes, his hair standing up on one side. Susie followed, dragging her father's coat behind her like a cape. They ate oatmeal at the table while Evelyn darned socks by the window, using the morning light. Billy talked about school, about the drawing he'd made of a train. Susie talked about Christmas, about what she hoped Santa might bring. A doll with real hair, she said, one that could close its eyes when you laid her down. Billy wanted books, adventure stories about cowboys or sailors. Evelyn listened and smiled and didn't tell them that Santa needed money too. In the afternoon, Evelyn's brother stopped by. Uncle Frank drove a delivery truck, and sometimes his route brought him past Maple Street. He stood in the doorway, too large for the small house, and looked around with the kind of expression people wear when they notice things they wish they hadn't. He stayed for 10 minutes. He asked how they were managing. Evelyn said they were fine. He didn't push. He left without offering anything but his company, and even that had felt like charity. After he'd gone, Evelyn found herself standing in the kitchen staring at the empty space where a proper Christmas should have been growing. The children were in their room, playing some quiet game. She opened the cabinet under the sink and moved aside the cleaning rags and the box of soap flakes. There, pushed to the back, sat an old glass jar. It had once held preserves years ago. Now it held nothing but dust. Evelyn washed it at the sink, dried it with a towel, and held it up to the light. The glass was clear, thick, sturdy. She found a pencil and a scrap of paper and wrote 2 words in her careful script: Christmas savings. She folded the paper and placed it inside the jar where it could be seen. Then she went to the bedroom and found her purse. Inside were 3 pennies, a nickel and a dime. She took the 3 pennies and dropped them into the jar. They landed with a small, bright sound that felt like the start of something. She carried the jar back to the kitchen and placed it under the sink again, behind the rags, where the children wouldn't find it. Then she sat down at the table and began to plan. The next morning, Evelyn walked to Mrs. Kimball's house to pick up mending. The route was 1.5 miles, but she didn't mind. Walking saved the bus fare. 15 cents saved was 15 cents earned, and the December air, though cold, felt clean in her lungs. She thought about the jar as she walked. 3 pennies wasn't much, but it was a beginning. She'd learned that beginnings mattered more than people thought. Robert had taught her that. He used to save bolts and screws in coffee cans in the basement, organizing them by size. He said you never knew when you'd need something small. Mrs. Kimball had 2 dresses that needed hemming and a jacket with a torn lining. She paid Evelyn $2.50, counting the coins carefully into her palm. Evelyn thanked her and tucked the money into her coat pocket. On the way home, she stopped at the grocer and bought a pound of flour, a small bag of sugar, and a can of milk. The total came to $1.90. She had 60 cents left. At home, she placed a quarter in the jar. The sound was more substantial than the pennies. Billy and Susie were sitting on the floor, cutting shapes out of old catalogs. Evelyn asked what they were making. "Decorations," Susie said, "for Christmas." Billy showed her a star he'd cut from a page of golden dresses. Evelyn told him it was beautiful. That evening, after a dinner of fried potatoes and the last of the bread, Billy asked if they could look for bottles in the alley. "Other boys at school did it," he said. "You could take them to Miller's store and get 2 cents for each one." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. She didn't like the idea of her children digging through trash, but she liked the idea of them understanding work. They went out together in the fading light, the 3 of them, and walked the alley behind the houses. They found 6 bottles that weren't broken. Billy carried them carefully in a burlap sack. At Miller's, the old man behind the counter counted them and gave Billy 12 cents. Billy looked at the money in his hand like it was a treasure. On the walk home, he asked if he could put some in the Christmas jar. Evelyn stopped walking. She hadn't told them about the jar. Billy saw her expression and explained that he'd seen it under the sink when he was looking for the scrub brush. He said he wouldn't tell Susie if it was a secret. Evelyn knelt down to his level, there on the sidewalk, and told him it wasn't a secret. It was a plan. He could help if he wanted to. That night, Billy put 8 cents in the jar. He kept 4 for himself, folding them into a handkerchief and hiding them in his sock drawer. Evelyn didn't ask why. Some things a boy needed to keep for himself. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Evelyn took every sewing job she could find,
working by lamplight after the children went to bed. Her eyes ached, but her hands stayed steady. She walked everywhere, saving fare after fare. She clipped coupons from Mrs. Patterson's old newspapers and used them at the market, saving 3 cents here, 5 cents there. Susie began helping too, though she didn't know about the jar yet. She'd count the pennies from Evelyn's purse at night, stacking them in little towers on the kitchen table. She'd tell her mother how many there were, proud of her arithmetic. Evelyn would thank her and take them back, and later, when Susie was asleep, she'd add what she could spare to the jar. The jar grew slowly. By the second week of December, it held nearly $2. Evelyn counted it one evening after the children were asleep, spreading the coins across the table in neat rows. $2 wouldn't buy much, but it would buy something. She allowed herself a moment of hope before sweeping the coins back into the jar. Margaret called again, this time to talk about the Christmas party her husband's company was throwing. There would be a dinner, she said, and dancing, and gifts for all the employees. She talked for 20 minutes without asking a single question. When she finally said goodbye, Evelyn realized her hand had cramped from holding the receiver. Uncle Frank didn't visit again, but he sent a Christmas card. Inside was a note saying he'd bring something for the children when he could. The card sat on the mantel, bright and cheerful, a promise that felt as thin as the paper it was printed on. The heat bill came on a Thursday. Evelyn opened it at the kitchen table and stared at the number. $12. She had 8 in her purse and 2 in the jar. She'd have to use the jar money. The thought made her chest tighten, but there was no choice. Cold was dangerous. Cold could hurt her children. She paid the bill the next day and started again with 30 cents. That night, she skipped dinner, telling Billy and Susie she'd eaten earlier. They had the last of the soup with crackers. She sat with them at the table, drinking water, watching them eat. Billy noticed but didn't say anything. Susie chattered about a song they'd learned at school, something about bells and snow. Evelyn listened and smiled and felt the hunger like a weight in her stomach. Before bed, she counted the jar again. 38 cents now. Billy had added 8 more from another bottle hunt. Evelyn held the jar up to the light and watched the coins catch the glow from the lamp. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. It was effort. It was hope. It was the only plan she had. She placed the jar back under the sink and went to bed with the sound of her children's breathing in the next room, steady and safe and warm for now. The third week of December arrived with gray skies and the kind of cold that made the house creak. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of paper torn from a notebook. She wrote Christmas at the top and underlined it. Then she began to make a list. She couldn't afford a real tree. The lots downtown wanted $3 for even the smallest spruce. But there were branches in the park, pine branches that had fallen during the last windstorm. She could gather those and tie them together, make something that looked close enough. The children wouldn't know the difference if she shaped it right. Decorations could be made. She had paper, glue from the school supply box, and ribbon scraps from her sewing basket. Billy's catalog stars could hang on the branches. Susie could make chains from colored paper. Evelyn still had string and a needle. She could thread popcorn if she could spare the kernels. For Billy, she'd make a wooden train. There was scrap wood in the basement, pieces Robert had saved from old projects. She'd seen his tools still hanging on the wall down there, dusty but sharp. She hadn't touched them since he died. Now she'd have to. The thought made her throat tight, but she wrote it down anyway. For Susie, a doll. Not a store-bought doll with real hair and closing eyes, but one she could sew from fabric scraps. She had enough muslin for a body, enough thread for features. She could use yarn from an old sweater for hair. She could make a dress from the leftover calico in the sewing basket. It would be simple, but it would be made with care. She'd bake cookies if the flour lasted. She'd wrap the gifts in newspaper and tie them with the ribbon scraps. She'd make Christmas morning feel like Christmas, even if it was smaller than before, even if it was quieter. Evelyn folded the paper and tucked it into her apron pocket. Then she put on her coat and boots and walked to the park. The park was empty, just bare trees and frozen ground. She found the fallen pine branches near the old pavilion, half buried in snow. She gathered as many as she could carry, their needles still green and fragrant. On the walk home, people stared at her, this woman hauling branches like kindling. She kept her eyes forward and her steps steady. At home, she laid the branches across the kitchen floor and began sorting them by size. Billy came in from playing outside and asked what she was doing. She told him she was building a tree. He knelt down beside her and helped arrange the branches, his cold fingers clumsy but eager. Susie joined them, and together they worked until the shape began to emerge, something like a tree, something close enough. That evening, after a dinner of beans and cornbread, Evelyn went down to the basement. The light was weak, just one bulb hanging from a wire. The tools were where Robert had left them, arranged on the pegboard in order. She ran her fingers along the handle of his saw, feeling the worn wood where his hands had held it. Then she picked up a piece of scrap pine and carried it upstairs. She worked on the train at night after Billy and Susie were asleep. She cut the wood carefully, using Robert's saw and his memory of how to measure twice and cut once. The train took shape slowly. A simple engine, a coal car, a caboose. She sanded the edges smooth with an old piece of sandpaper, working by lamplight at the kitchen table. Her hands cramped, but she kept going. The doll came together more easily. She cut the muslin and stitched it, stuffing the body with cotton from an old pillow. She embroidered the face with careful, small stitches, 2 eyes, a nose, a smile. She unraveled the yellow yarn from the sweater and sewed it to the head in long strands, then braided it. She made a dress from the calico, tiny and neat, with a hem and small buttons from her button jar. Mrs. Patterson noticed Evelyn's light on late one evening and knocked on the door the next morning. She brought a small bag of flour and said she'd bought too much by accident. Evelyn knew it was a lie, the kind meant to preserve dignity. She accepted it with gratitude that felt almost like grief. With the flour, she could bake cookies. She found a recipe written in her mother's handwriting, tucked into an old cookbook. Sugar cookies, simple and sweet. She made the dough one evening while the children were at school, using the sugar she'd saved and the eggs Mrs. Patterson had also brought. She rolled the dough thin and cut shapes with the rim of a drinking glass. Circles, all of them, but circles were fine. The cookies baked while she worked on Susie's doll dress, the kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of vanilla. Billy came home and stood in the doorway, breathing it in. He asked if they were for Christmas. Evelyn said yes. He nodded, serious, like she'd told him something important. By the end of the week, the gifts were finished. The train sat wrapped in newspaper on the top shelf of her closet. The doll was hidden in a hot box under her bed. The cookies were stored in a tin, out of sight. The tree of branches stood in the corner of the front room, still bare but ready for decorating. Evelyn counted the jar again. $1.40. She'd spent some on glue and thread, but she'd saved enough for something extra, something she hadn't planned. She wasn't sure what yet. Maybe fruit for Christmas morning, maybe milk, maybe just the comfort of knowing there was something left. She placed the jar back under the sink and looked at the tree. It wasn't much, none of it was much, but it was made, not bought. It was effort and time and thought. It was the best she could do, and for now, that had to be enough. Billy woke up coughing on a Monday morning, the week before Christmas. The sound was wet and deep, rattling in his chest. Evelyn felt his forehead and found it hot. She gave him water and told him to stay in bed. By afternoon, the fever had climbed. Billy lay under the blankets, shivering despite the warmth. Susie sat in the corner of the room, watching her brother with wide, worried eyes. Evelyn made him broth from the soup bones she'd been saving, but he couldn't keep it down. The coughing grew worse as the evening wore on. Evelyn knew she had to take him to the doctor. She counted the money in her purse, 60 cents. She went to the jar under the sink and took out $1. Her hands shook as she did it. This was Christmas money. This was hope. But hope didn't matter if Billy was sick. Dr. Morrison's office was 6 blocks away. Evelyn bundled Billy in his coat and helped him walk, Susie trailing behind them. The cold air made Billy cough harder. Inside the office, they waited on wooden chairs while other families came and went. When their turn came, Dr. Morrison examined Billy with gentle hands and a stethoscope that was cold against his skin. Bronchitis, the doctor said. Not pneumonia yet, but close. He needed medicine and rest and warmth. Dr. Morrison wrote a prescription and told Evelyn to keep him home from school for at least a week. The office visit cost $1. The medicine at the pharmacy cost another $1.20. Evelyn walked home with the brown bottle in her pocket and 30 cents left to her name. The jar was empty again. All that saving, all those walks and skipped meals and careful pennies, gone in a single afternoon. That night she gave Billy his medicine and sat beside him until he fell asleep. Susie climbed into bed next to her brother, her small hand resting on his arm. Evelyn watched them both and felt something crack open inside her chest. She'd failed. She'd tried so hard, and it hadn't been enough. In the kitchen, she looked at the empty jar. She thought about Christmas, now 5 days away. She had the gifts she'd made, but nothing else. No money for fruit or milk or anything extra. No way to make the morning special beyond what she'd already created. Susie found her there, standing at the sink in the dark. She asked if Santa was still coming. Her voice was small and uncertain. Evelyn knelt down and pulled her daughter close. She said that Santa always came, but sometimes he needed help. She said that magic wasn't something you could buy in a store. It was something you made with your hands and your heart. Susie nodded against her shoulder, but Evelyn could feel her doubt. The next day, Margaret called again. She talked about the presents she'd bought, the feast she was planning. She mentioned the ham she'd ordered from the butcher, 15 pounds, enough for their whole family and guests besides. She asked, almost as an afterthought, how Evelyn was managing. Fine, Evelyn said. They were doing fine. Margaret said she'd heard from Uncle Frank that things were tight. She said it was a shame, really. She said maybe next year would be better. Then she said she had to go. The delivery man was at the door with packages. The line went dead. Evelyn stood holding the receiver until the dial tone hummed. Then she hung up and went back to Billy, who was still coughing in his bed. The heat stayed off most nights now. Evelyn couldn't afford to run it. They huddled together instead, all 3 of them in the big bed, under every blanket in the house and Robert's winter coat. Billy's fever broke on Wednesday, but the coughing continued. Susie started to worry aloud, asking questions about whether they'd done something wrong, whether Santa was mad at them. Evelyn tried to reassure her, but the words felt hollow. She lay awake at night, listening to her children breathe, and prayed prayers she wasn't sure anyone was hearing. She asked for help. She asked for strength. She asked for enough. On Thursday evening, Mrs. Patterson knocked on the door with a basket. Inside were potatoes, a jar of her homemade jam, and a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. She didn't say anything about charity. She just said she'd made too much and thought Evelyn might save her from eating it all herself. Evelyn thanked her with tears in her eyes. That night she took on an extra sewing job from Mrs. Kimball. A coat that needed the lining completely replaced, detailed work that would take hours. Mrs. Kimball offered $3. Evelyn accepted and worked through the night, her fingers moving by muscle memory while her mind drifted. She thought about Robert. She thought about the life they'd planned, the one that was supposed to have more time. By dawn, the coat was finished. She delivered it on Friday morning and took the $3 with a gratitude that felt almost unbearable. At home, she put $1 in the jar. The sound of it hitting the glass was both hopeful and heartbreaking. Christmas was 2 days away. Billy was better, his fever gone, his coughing fading to something manageable. Susie helped her mother hang the paper decorations on the branch tree. They looked fragile in the lamplight, delicate and temporary, but they were there. They were something. That night, after the children were asleep, Evelyn brought out the wrapped gifts and placed them under the tree. The newspaper wrapping looked shabby, but she'd tied each one with ribbon and written the names carefully. She stood back and looked at the scene. It was small, it was simple, it was all she had. She went to the jar and counted what was left, $1.15, enough for milk and maybe some oranges, enough for Christmas morning to feel a little more like Christmas. She placed the jar back under the sink and sat at the table in the dark. Outside, snow was falling again, soft and steady. Inside, her children slept, safe and warm and loved. It would have to be enough. There was nothing else she could give them but this, but her effort, but her hope that love could fill the spaces where money should have been. Christmas morning came, cold and bright. Evelyn woke before the sun and lay in bed for a moment, listening to the silence. Then she heard it. Small footsteps in the hallway, whispers. The children were awake. She got up and put on her robe, moving quietly to the kitchen. She started a fire in the stove and set the kettle on for coffee. Then she arranged the cookies on a plate, the ones she'd baked earlier in the week. The smell of them filled the kitchen, warm and sweet. Billy appeared first, his eyes wide. He looked at the tree in the corner, at the packages underneath, at the cookies on the table. Susie came right behind him, still in her nightgown, her hair tangled from sleep. She stopped in the doorway and stared. Evelyn told them Merry Christmas. Her voice caught on the words, but she smiled. Billy ran to the tree and knelt down, reading the names on the packages. Susie followed more slowly, her hands clasped in front of her like she was afraid to touch anything. They opened the gifts one at a time. Billy unwrapped his first, tearing the newspaper carefully. When he saw the wooden train, his face transformed. He lifted it out with both hands, turning it over, examining every piece. He looked at his mother with an expression she hadn't seen in months, pure and uncomplicated joy. He said it was perfect. He said it was exactly what he wanted. Susie opened hers next, her small fingers struggling with the ribbon. When she pulled out the doll, she went very still. She touched the yellow yarn hair, the embroidered face, the tiny calico dress. Then she pulled it to her chest and hugged it tight. She looked at her mother with tears in her eyes and said thank you so quietly it was almost a whisper. Evelyn had to turn away for a moment, pretending to check the coffee. Her own eyes were burning. She hadn't known if it would be enough. She hadn't known if handmade gifts would feel like enough when other children had store-bought toys and expensive games. But looking at Billy and Susie, at the way they held their gifts like treasures, she understood that she'd given them something worth more than money. They ate breakfast at the table, cookies and milk that Evelyn had bought with the last of the jar money. It wasn't much, but it tasted like celebration. Billy made his train move across the table, making whistle sounds. Susie fed her doll imaginary food, talking to her in a soft, motherly voice. There was a knock at the door just after 8. Evelyn opened it to find Mrs. Patterson standing there with a pie, cherry, still warm. She said she'd made 2 by accident and wondered if Evelyn's family might help her with the extra. Evelyn invited her in. Mrs. Patterson stayed for an hour, drinking coffee and watching the children play. She didn't mention the scarcity of gifts or the makeshift tree. She just smiled and said it looked like a real Christmas. After she left, the children asked if they could go outside. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving everything clean and white. Evelyn bundled them into their coats and watched from the porch as they ran into the yard. Billy pulled Susie on an old sled they'd found in the basement. Susie's laughter carried across the cold air, bright and clear. Evelyn stood in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself. The house behind her was quiet. The tree stood in its corner, simple but complete. The gifts had been opened and loved. The morning had happened, despite everything that had tried to prevent it. She thought about Margaret's house across town, about the 15-pound ham and the store-bought presents and the decorated tree that probably reached the ceiling. She thought about the parties and the guests and the abundance that filled rooms where money wasn't a worry, and she felt something unexpected. Not envy, not bitterness, but a quiet kind of pride. Her children were playing in the snow with handmade toys and full hearts. They hadn't asked for more. They hadn't complained about less. They'd woken up on Christmas morning and found joy in what was there, not in what was missing. That was something Margaret's money couldn't buy. The day passed slowly, gently. They ate Mrs. Patterson's pie for lunch. They played with the train and the doll until both children could barely keep their eyes open. They sat by the tree and looked at the decorations, and Susie said it was the most beautiful tree she'd ever seen. As evening came and the light began to fade, Evelyn lit the lamp in the front room. Billy was on the floor with his train. Susie was in the chair with her doll in her lap, humming a song. Evelyn sat at the table with her mending, watching them both. Outside, the world was cold and hard. Bills would come, work would be scarce, winter would last for months yet. But inside, in this small house on Maple Street, there was warmth, there was love, there was enough. They walked outside together before bed, all three of them, just to look at the snow under the stars. Billy pointed out constellations he'd learned at school. Susie made a tiny snowman, no bigger than her doll. Evelyn stood in between them with a hand on each of their shoulders, breathing in the cold air and feeling something like peace settle into her bones. When they went back inside, the children got ready for bed without being asked. Billy set his train on the dresser where he could see it. Susie tucked her doll in beside her, arranging the covers just so. Evelyn kissed them both good night and stood in the doorway, watching them fall asleep. The house was quiet again. Christmas was ending the way it had begun, with silence and cold and the weight of everything unsaid. But something had changed. Something had been made real in the space between wanting and having. The Pennies hadn't bought abundance. They'd bought something more fragile and more lasting than that. They'd bought this day, this morning, this moment of their children's happiness. And that, Evelyn thought, as she turned off the light, was worth every penny she had saved, and every meal she had skipped, and every night she had worked until her hands ached. It was worth everything. The day after Christmas, Evelyn woke early and cleaned the house. She took down the paper decorations carefully, folding them and storing them in a box for next year. She gathered the pine branches and carried them outside, leaving them by the back door to dry. They'd make good kindling eventually. The wrapped newspaper from the gifts she smoothed flat and saved. Paper was useful. It could wrap other things, line shelves, start fires. Nothing was wasted. Nothing ever could be. She washed the cookie plate and put it away. She swept the kitchen floor and wiped down the table. The house felt empty without the decorations, but clean, ready for whatever came next. In the afternoon, Billy and Susie played quietly in their room. The train rolled across the floor. The doll sat propped against the wall, watching. Evelyn could hear their voices, low and content, making up stories. She listened from the kitchen and felt something ease in her chest. Later, while the children napped, she retrieved a jar from under the sink. It was empty now, every penny spent. She washed it at the sink, dried it carefully, and held it up to the light the way she had that first day. The glass was still clear, still sturdy. She found the piece of paper that said Christmas savings and placed it back inside. Then she went to her purse and took out the 3 pennies she'd been paid for mending Mrs. Henderson's hem that morning. She dropped them into the jar. The sound was familiar now, small and bright and hopeful. She placed the jar back under the sink and stood there for a moment, her hands on the edge of the counter. Next year would come. Bills would come sooner. Winter would be long, and work would be hard to find. But she'd start again. She'd save again. She'd do what she'd always done, which was find a way through. That evening, the telephone rang. It was Uncle Frank. He apologized for not coming by on Christmas. He said he'd been meaning to, but work had been busy. He asked how the children were. Evelyn said they were fine. They'd had a good Christmas. He sounded relieved, like he'd been worried she might say otherwise. He promised again to bring something by for the children soon. Evelyn thanked him and hung up without expecting anything. Margaret didn't call. Evelyn hadn't expected her to. But it didn't matter now. It hadn't mattered for a long time, really. The people who'd helped, who'd quietly showed up with flour and pie and kindness, they were the ones who mattered. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Kimball, even Dr. Morrison, who'd let her pay for Billy's medicine in installments without her having to ask. The relatives with their big houses and their loud celebrations and their empty promises, they were just noise. They always had been. On the last evening of December, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked out the window. Snow was falling again, light and steady. The street was quiet, everyone inside their warm houses. Lights glowed in windows, smoke rose from chimneys. She thought about the pennies in the jar under the sink. 3 of them now, the beginning of something new. She thought about what they represented, not just money, but effort and sacrifice and stubborn hope. Each penny was a choice to walk instead of ride, a choice to skip a meal, a choice to work late into the night, a choice to believe that small things could add up to something larger. The pennies hadn't bought toys from a store. They hadn't bought a tree or a feast or anything that looked like abundance, but they'd bought something else. They'd bought dignity. They'd bought the knowledge that she'd tried, that she'd done everything she could, that she hadn't given up or given in. They'd bought the look on Billy's face when he opened that wooden train. They'd bought Susie's tears of joy over a homemade doll. They'd bought a Christmas morning that her children would remember, not because of what they'd received, but because of what they'd felt. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that had always been the point. Billy came into the kitchen, his train in his hands. He asked if they could go out and look at the stars again, like they'd done on Christmas night. Evelyn smiled and said yes. She called for Susie, and the 3 of them put on their coats and boots. Outside, the snow crunched under their feet. The air was cold enough to see their breath. They stood in the yard and looked up. The sky was clear now, full of stars that seemed brighter against the winter darkness. Billy pointed out Orion. Susie asked if the stars were cold. Evelyn said she didn't know, but she thought they were probably warm, burning bright and far away. They stayed outside until their fingers went numb and their noses turned red. Then they went back inside to the warm kitchen, to the lamplight and the quiet house and the life they'd built from almost nothing. Later, after the children were asleep, Evelyn sat at the table one last time. She thought about the year that had passed and the year that was coming. She thought about pennies and jars and the quiet way that hope accumulated when you refused to let it go. She understood now what the savings had really been about. Not the money itself, but the act of saving had given her purpose, direction, a way to move forward when everything else felt impossible.
The jar hadn't just held coins, it had held her determination to make something out of nothing, to give her children a Christmas that felt like love, even when she had no money to spend. The pennies had taught her children something too, though they didn't know it yet. They'd learned that you could be happy with less, that handmade could be beautiful, that effort mattered more than expense. Those were lessons that would last longer than any store-bought toy, lessons that would carry them through their own hard years when they came. Evelyn finished her tea and rinsed the cup at the sink. She looked at the space where the jar sat hidden, and she thought about starting again tomorrow, about the long, slow work of saving for next Christmas and the Christmas after that, and all the Christmases to come until her children were grown and gone and making their own way. It would be hard. It would always be hard. But she'd done it once, and she could do it again. The pennies would add up, the jar would fill, and when December came around again, she'd be ready. She turned off the kitchen light and walked to her room. In the darkness, she could hear her children breathing in their sleep, safe and warm and loved. That sound was worth more than all the money in all the jars in all the world. The pennies hadn't bought abundance. They'd bought something quieter and truer than that. They'd bought the knowledge that love could stretch further than money ever could, that sacrifice could feel like grace, and that Christmas lived not in what you spent, but in what you gave of yourself when there was nothing else left to give.